All right, Bulls and Bears, welcome to another dose of economic reality here. Bull to the bust here, BX4. Thank you for joining in today. It's Saturday as I'm recording this. Might put it out on a later time slot here today, so you might be watching this on Sunday. Either way, thank you for being here. Got some updates to get into today, some things that I couldn't include in yesterday's report due to time constraints. But the economy, even though the central banks, the top 10%, especially the top 1%, the talking heads out there trying to convince everyone that the economy's strong, that the consumer's strong, that everything's fine, that the central bankers, they've got this, they engineered the economy into this quote unquote soft landing. Well, even the phony manipulated numbers are starting to look bad now, right? And they've kept this economy looking pretty good on the surface. If you don't really dig behind the numbers, if you don't read between the lines, you may be one of the people that's just believed the narrative that this economy is strong. In the meantime, you've got people in record amounts of debt. Late payments are piling up like never before with the foreclosures starting to increase now. Hasn't got to alarming numbers yet, but it's starting to increase. Credit card delinquencies, car payment delinquencies, those things are already at alarming numbers. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But let's take a look at some of the news, the way it's being reported, and a lot of these outlets, these news outlets. These are the same outlets that had been painting a very rosy picture of the economy. Well, even they have to acknowledge, even the phony numbers are starting to look pretty bad right now here. Um, Meaning, if they weren't phony, they'd be a lot worse than they are. A lousy jobs report forces Fed to reckon with hard landing. Policymakers have been focusing on squarely on inflation. Now they need to worry about the labor market too. Yeah, with the lousy job numbers that just came out. But what happens when consumers get to the end of the line of their credit limits, when their credit cards start to be maxed out? We know it's about 1 in 5 consumers right now are either very close or are maxed out on their credit cards. And we're going to talk about the banks here in just a few minutes. Are banks tightening now that so many people are getting towards the edge or towards the limit? We're going to talk about that again here in a few minutes as well. But the jobs numbers are starting to reflect the pullback in consumer spending. And we've seen just over the past few weeks big red flags that consumers are pulling back on their spending. We looked at McDonald's, Starbucks, and people are pulling back. Now, if you look at the amount of money people are spending, that's still going up higher just because people are paying more for necessities. But there are a lot of people out there starting to cut back on the wants and only buying what they need, right? Not very many yet, but it's starting to be noticeable. So we even have headlines out there about hard landing being possible. So pretty interesting. We'll have to see how this plays out here. We've got the stock markets now in correction territory. Warren Buffett is raising some eyebrows here as he's raising cash to a record $277 billion after slashing his stock holdings. So, is it a concern to anyone here? Please let me know down in the comments that Warren Buffett now has a record amount of cash set aside. Does he see something? We've been saying this for a while, and yes, there's plenty they can do to keep this propped up. But does he see something on the very near horizon? Right? We'll have to see how that plays out as well. But look at this here. That's being reported here. Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway slashes Apple stake. We're starting to see some of these tech stocks, some of these high-flying tech stocks in correction territory. Now, let's shift gears here for just a minute. Let's get into some real estate and the prices of homes. Now, people are looking for affordable places to live. Here's something very interesting that I just found today. Oh, and let me talk first about my trip to Big Lots because that was something I put in the title here. Went to Big Lots today. It was supposedly a going out of business sale. None of the food items were on sale. All the food items, food and drinks, both. I went in to get a few energy drinks. I'm like, okay, maybe they'll be half off. None of the food or drinks were on sale. It was still the original price, which is very high. I think Big Lots is kind of expensive. And the shelves were full, right? You would expect to be going out of business, liquidating, that the shelves would be at least half empty. Everything that was regular price, hardly any of it was gone. The shelves were full. The stuff that was on sale was like 10 and 20% off. Even that wasn't all the way gone. So I think that's another sign that consumers are not really spending unless something is on super sale or discount, right? Same thing. I went in to get energy drinks. The energy drinks were $3.50 each, right? And I try to get healthy ones that don't have like artificial flavors and stuff like that. So there wasn't a lot of the type of energy drink that I buy, but the ones they did have that I would have bought, I'm not gonna pay $4 for an energy drink when I can go to another store and get it for cheaper. So Big Lots going out of business prices were still higher than other grocery stores and food places that I go to. So I walked out of there, didn't buy anything. But Big Lots going out of business here in my hometown. Not all locations are going out of business, but the one in my hometown is, and they're going to be going out of business. The sale that they're trying to get everything cleaned out, they're going to be a year, it looks like, before they clean everything out. They're going to have to slash their prices because I went in there today and it was obvious to me that people were not buying things. The shelves were still full. Even the items that were 10, 20% off, a lot of the shelves were mostly full. I mean, more so than the food items that weren't on sale. They had a bigger stock, but to me, that was a sign. Let's talk about affordable real estate here. First of all, Death Valley setting records for high temperatures. That's what between California and Nevada. Death Valley average temperature of 108 in July here. Let's see here, and it actually set a record of 121. Wow, almost 122 last month, tying a record in 1917. So maybe things would be cheaper out there, right? Not that anybody wants to live in Death Valley, but somebody might want to live in Death Valley because a home just sold here, or it's pending in this case. And this is the Death Valley vicinity, what do they call it here? Uh, even the name of the roads out there, North Diablo Drive. You think that might indicate some heat? Diablo. Um, Arma Armargosa Valley. So this is from what I read in the Death Valley vicinity, folks. Even way out here, Death Valley, 110 plus temperatures, 120, almost a record or tying a record. $325,000 for being way out in the middle of nowhere. Okay, looks like it's been upgraded, of course, but look at the outside of this place. This is your front yard. Hardly any shade trees around. Would anyone want to be buying a home out there for 300,000? It would be enough if you could just buy the home for cash and not have to worry about it. But no, you're gonna have to pay property taxes. How far are you gonna have to drive to work if you still have to work, unless you're getting a check in the mail each month? How far are you gonna have to drive to work just to pay the property taxes, to pay the maintenance, the upkeep, utility costs? So interesting, folks. Even Death Valley, 300 plus $1,000 for a home. I mean, there's another sign that this housing bubble is insane in the membrane, folks. All right, let's move on here. I like to touch on real estate here as much as I can, but let's talk about what's happening up in Canada. Canada, home prices higher than the United States, even further detached from incomes versus the United States. The housing bubble there is even much bigger. Look at this. Canadians starting to go bankrupt at a startling rate, not seen in many, many years. It's being reported here. The country's ongoing cost of living crisis. Again, this is global. It's not just the United States. Some countries worse than others, but Canada has seen rock bottom interest rates for a decade plus. Canadians deeper in debt, pushing Canadians deeper in debt, the cost of living. Insolvencies has reached the highest level in years. Consumer insolvencies increased by 11.3% here just in the past 2 months compared to last year. The number of personal filings is also up, corporate and personal filings. There was a 17.9% increase in May compared to 12 months earlier. Right, so we're seeing this in Canada. We're seeing this in the United States. The numbers are getting worse. And again, I have to go back and say this is not just a leadership issue. You're not going to see much change in November, even though there are some wedge issues that they're pushing out there and they're talking about in the news nonstop. You know, what's that? Reproductive rights is, I was trying to think of the term that I'm supposed to say. Reproductive rights, that's a wedge issue. The border, that's a wedge issue. There's going to be these topics out there that are going to, push people from one side or the other, or right versus left. Ultimately, when it comes down to the economy, the monetary system, the cost of living, Not much is going to change, folks. It's going to be more rescue programs. We've got down payment assistance programs in all 50 states, thousands of different programs here to get people into homes. Instead of letting the prices of homes and more come down, they're just finding new ways to get people financed, to get people to borrow more money, right? You see what they're doing here? Also, investors are buying a lot of homes. In fact, let's jump over to that real quick as far as investors buying homes. Take a look at this here out of Florida. Corporate greed, also known as inflation or greedflation is what they're calling it. How investors are forcing rent hikes and evictions in Florida. Right? So investors came in, bought lots of homes. They just come in, they start raising the rents. Folks, if these were local owners, then you probably wouldn't see this big of an increase in the rent hikes here. This is massive, folks. So forcing rent hikes and evictions in Florida. A study found as the evictional capital of the state, shedding light on a growing issue of corporate investors flocking to Florida. Of course, they saw a big population rush into Florida ever since 2020. So investors naturally, they want to take advantage of that. When people are flocking to a state because it's a little bit cheaper, then all of a sudden investors flock there, buy up as much real estate as possible, and just start raising the rents. So what used to be a cheap place, not cheap anymore, right? So there's no place left to run pretty soon if this keeps up, right? And we saw this in states like California, before, where investors would come in and buy up, in this case, half the real estate, half of home sales in the United States, or rather, half of the home sales right now in California are to investors, where the home ownership here in the state of California is only 50%. Across the rest of the country, it's closer to 64%. So investors do flock more heavily to the more expensive markets because these real big companies, they can come in and they can pay cash for, sometimes they buy hundreds of homes at once. And then, of course, they can actually control the rent price, because when you own a lot of real estate and you raise the rents on everything, then it's really, again, no place left to run. So this is becoming a big problem in Florida, and people are now looking to move out of Florida. We're seeing more people moving out now than moving in, but not much place to go unless you want to move to Death Valley or Armagosa Valley, whatever it was called. And even then, you're paying $300,000 for a home in the middle of nowhere, folks. This is insane. This is insane. Look at this headline here out of China. China's top economist calls for higher inflation to spur growth. Right? Think about that. More inflation, which makes it harder for people. That's growth. They're calling that growth. Right? And one of the lessons I try to teach people here is that this economic growth that has been put in the spotlight for many years is mainly inflationary. It's mainly consumers paying more for stuff, right? So when prices go up, it looks like the economy is growing because people are spending more. When people spend more, that's the GDP, that's the gross domestic product, or that's part of it, a big part of it. And then they can say, oh, look, the economy's growing. Isn't this great? In the meantime, people are taking on record amounts of debt. Remember, the countries that went into hyperinflation, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Weimar Germany, all these hyperinflationary countries that went through that, economic growth looked great on the way to hyperinflation, right? Because people were spending money, and then more money and more money. They had to print more so people can spend more. They had to loan out more. They had to back the banks so banks could keep on giving out loans and credit cards in order to keep people spending and keeping people being able to buy the more expensive items that kept getting higher in price. But that was called economic growth. And then finally, one day it got too much where people were like, wow, this is crazy. We're in hyperinflation. What happened? They told us the economy was growing. Yeah, the economy's growing, all right. But the economic growth you were told about is things getting more expensive and people spending more money and having to borrow more money just to survive. Right? Again, not the United States, China, all over the world. Australia, we talked about a couple reports ago. Canada, that's happening in most countries, folks. So anyone, again, that thinks that something big is going to change in November, I would, encourage you not to get your hopes up here. All right, let's move on here. A couple other things to get into. Let's talk about the increase in the unemployment number. We just had this report out showing the uptick again from the first quarter to the second quarter. I'm sorry, that's the bank's tightening here. Let me get to the right chart here. 1-year chart. Unemployment ticking up. Here we go. From June, this is monthly, 4.1, to July, 4.3. Interesting, right? Now let's go out to a longer term chart. And what do we see before every economic downturn or recession? We see the unemployment rate start to increase, right? It's uptrend. So what do we see going into 2008? We saw it at 4.4, 4.7, and then all of a sudden, boom, then it spiked. In this case, up to almost 10%. We saw it briefly in 2020, but they printed so much money and they rescued the markets with so much money printing that it was very brief. But now look, we're seeing it tick up again. We were down in the 3.5% range, 3.7, 3.9, right? So we see this happening. Now the latest reading, 4.3. So this is historically a warning sign. Look at every previous recession. Before the recession hit, this unemployment number started to tick up. If you're looking at the chart here, you're seeing me go back all the way to the 90s here, late 80s, and even back here, 70s. Unemployment ticking up, recession. Unemployment ticking up, recession. In some cases, the recession happened before unemployment ticked up, but that's why you see the spike. After it starts ticking up, then you see the spike because then there is a recession, then everybody knows it, and companies really stop hiring. You think it's bad now with the dismal job numbers last week or just a few days ago. It's going to get even worse once this is put out there. Once economic reality starts being broadcast to the masses, people are going to really pull back on spending because the people that just trust, the business news that they watch on their local TV channel, even they're going to realize something's going on. And then you see the spending pull back even more, and then it really hits the fan, folks. Everybody gets scared. People are scared to spend. But how will the response be? That's the tip right here. That's the key. Will it be massive helicopter money like 2020 to 2024 like we've seen so far? Or will it be tightening where banks are afraid to loan out money, where people are forced to cut back on their spending because they can no longer run up more debt? That's the key. If that happens, if you see banks tighten, then avalanche, folks, downturn. Otherwise, and the downturn avalanche that I'm talking about will be deflationary if banks tighten. But if banks are guaranteed life support, folks, it's going to be an inflationary recession, folks. So no one can predict this because they don't know either will the banks be backstopped to infinity or not. And we're not talking about the local banks. We're talking about the mega banks that then they buy out the smaller banks. You see what I'm saying? Consolidation. So even that's not going to stop the lending because when the smaller banks just get taken over by the bigger banks, there's no tightening there. The bigger banks just keep loaning out money even though they've absorbed a lot of bad loans from the smaller bank that failed. They still keep loaning out the money because they're guaranteed endless life support. And that's the inflationary side of things that we have to look for, folks. So nobody knows which way it's going to go because it's all dependent on the decision of a few people. Will there be instant or will there be infinite backing of the banks? Or will deflation be allowed is what I'm trying to say. It's all going to be decided by a few people, folks. So prepare accordingly, right? We don't know what it's going to be. I say prepare for both because depending on what decisions are made, that's going to determine the direction here, right? It's not very simple to figure out, but be ready for both and you'll be okay. I'm going to wrap this one up, folks. Keep stacking, everybody. Big love. Make sure you are subscribed. Keep this channel alive. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Appreciate you being here. Peace now. Bye.